Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Anselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about data and its use in the volatile markets in which we find themselves, which actually was the subject of a recent webinar that my two guests today were actually part of, Paige Bartley and David Coluccio. Welcome to the podcast to you both.
Great to be here, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. Excited to be here.
The podcast that you were doing this last week really was digging into some data aspects. It was covering some of our research perspectives, some we're doing. But I wanted to start with just a little background on both of you. I mean, Paige, you've been on the podcast before. Some of our listeners may know you from some of the data perspectives and the regulatory and privacy. What are the basics of your coverage areas and what were you working on in the podcast?
Sure. So I cover all things related to enterprise practices in data management. So looking at how organizations leverage and govern and basically manage their data for business benefit within the organization.
It ties in pretty nicely to the subject of the webinar. And David, what are areas that you cover?
Sure. So I'm responsible for the channels organization, which in essence takes all the data that we have at S&P Global. And our team is responsible for taking the data, linking it, structuring it, and delivering it out to our clients through FTP feed, API, or cloud distribution.
I think the thing that's interesting about the webinar was really how it was leveraging data. And not surprisingly, I will have links to the webinar, the replay of the webinar in the show notes for our listeners. But the thing I thought was interesting was really looking at both sides of the aspects of data, how people are really using it to put it to work, some of the concerns about being able to really get the most out of data that you have available, how you're handling it, how you're working with it. In the webinar was dealing with some really interesting aspects of data. We're looking at the Purchasing Managers Index, one of those things that you contrast with Consumer Price Index. But then we're really digging into some of the research that we've been doing, and Paige, that you shepherd, in terms of how people are actually getting to put data to work. And that, I think, as we've oft talked about on the podcast, it's not so much having data, it's being able to get access to it, it's being able to understand what to do with it. There are a lot of different pieces to this, but the research that you were talking about on the webinar really digs into a number of different aspects of this. What were the highlights of that?
Of course. So one of the things we looked at in the webinar was just, we see organizations today are trying to become more data-driven. We take that for granted. We consider it common knowledge, but why? Why is this a trend? And one of the common themes that was supported by data in the webinar is that the motivation for becoming more data-driven has gone through a pivot over the last several years. And if we think of the pandemic as being for lack of better words, a pivotal time. It really has changed the way organizations look at data as a resource within the organization. And looking at some of the survey data that we have on data-driven practices, we saw that over the last several years, organizations in their motivation for becoming more data-driven, the reasons they want to become more data-driven today are to ensure that business resiliency for the next unexpected event. So looking at the top expected benefits of becoming more data-driven today, you look at things like improving and automating business processes. You look at things like increasing agility of decision-making. You look at enhancing customer service and engagement. Really things that maintain your business sustainability long-term. Whereas if you rewind the clock and you go back before the pandemic, you go back to late 2019, some of those top expected benefits for being data-driven, when we originally asked that question, they just tended to be lowering costs and increasing sales. Very much tied to a quarterly cadence, very metrics-driven. Understandable, of course, and those benefits we still do see in our surveys of why organizations want to leverage data. But today, those perceived benefits are lower on the list. Today, we see organizations wanting to leverage data to survive and advance in a volatile market.
Well, and maintaining situational awareness, which I think to your point wasn't as strong a focus until everybody got blindsided by the various changes that the pandemic happened to bring on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would say we've been seeing it as well on the data side. As more and more clients, as you highlighted, Paige, are trying to automate their processes. They're looking for data to be linked already. They keep on telling us the non-proprietary stuff we want you guys to handle. And so they're asking us, can you link the data? Can you deliver it to us in our environment so we no longer have to manage taking data from an FTP site and bringing it into our environment so that we could then start doing the analysis. Automate that stuff for us so we can focus on that special sauce that really will help drive business growth.
Well, and there's one of the interesting things about the data that, even you point out the fact that, those that are really looking to consume data and work with it want to be able to step over a lot of the mundane aspects of simply accumulating and managing it when, years back, that was something that you had to take on. It was difficult to be able to find data sources that were sufficiently robust and clean, as we've talked about with Nick Patience and a lot of the things about actually being able to ensure the quality of the data is good, to now moving to a situation where really they want to put it to work, and they don't want to have to spend all that time moving through it. And as our listeners have heard me say over and over again, it's that value of technology is moving up that level of abstraction. In the past, you had to work with raw data. There was a lot that had to be done to prepare it, manage it, ingest it, get it into a place where you could then work with it. Now we've got tools to be able to manage it. But one of the things about the data, I think, Paige, you were talking about at the webinar, is something that we continue to see, which is differences in expectations and some of the challenges between users with different levels of sophistication. And we break those down into a number of different classifications. The thing that I thought was interesting about this was the difference between the data drivers and the data drifters in terms of what they saw as challenges in being able to do more with data.
Yeah, and I think the baseline to set here is that when we conduct our surveys, we ask a foundational question in many of our surveys where we just ask them, how data driven are your strategic decisions within the organization? And from there, we can sort of bucket organizations roughly into two camps, where if they make most or nearly all of their strategic decisions based on data, we consider them to be data drivers. Where if they make some or few of those decisions based on data, we tend to consider them data drifters. And so there you can kind of do a bifurcated split into sort of two camps. And that's where you start to see really interesting demographic differences in how businesses perform and what challenges they see in trying to leverage that data internally. And when we look at barriers to becoming more data-driven, the organizations that already base a lot of their strategic decisions on data, a lot of those challenges tend to be technology-based. So they're already investing in a lot of technology. They're already using a lot of technology. They're already very technology aware. So technology tends to be very front of mind. The complexity of their IT ecosystems tend to be fairly high. So we see things like data quality and consistency being a top pain point. We see things like data privacy being a top pain point, being aware of those regulations and those requirements related to data privacy and data security. Integration of legacy data sources and architecture is also a common theme when you have a more mature organization that is highly mature in how they make decisions with data. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when you have a data drifter who is basing less of those decisions on data, there's a different sort of demographic where a lot of their challenges tend to be more cultural in nature. So you look at things like availability of skilled resources and talent. So how do they recruit? How do they find the right people for the job? How do they upskill internally? Or most commonly, availability of budget. That tends to be a very persistent problem. And if you go down the list, just availability and buy-in of leadership is more of a problem for these less mature organizations. So disproportionately, when you're less mature in those data-driven practices, the cultural challenges tend to be something that are uh, more pertinent to you as an organization. So I guess the takeaway would be, if you are an organization that's trying to advance on that data-driven journey, there needs to be a little bit of introspection to realize where you are in that maturity curve. And if you are lower on the maturity curve, it may be cultural problems that you need to address first before you can dive into the technology.
And I would say, Paige, if you look at the market today and the demand for data scientists, it kind of falls in line in terms of a lot of these data drifters that want to be drivers. And they're looking to hire all these data scientists to be able to do more with data. And then when you look at the drivers, like you highlighted, I think an issue that has been popping up has been all these new alternative data providers. And you're dealing with new firms that have been collecting data for a specific industry or sector. And now they realize that this data potentially could add value to, let's say, the capital markets. But they haven't performed, as you highlighted, that data quality that the capital markets have expected over the years. And now, as they're bringing in this new and exciting data, they're realizing there's a lot of problems and a lot of holes, and they need to make sure that they have teams or tools or technology to be able to identify errors and mistakes in the data before they incorporate it into their models.
I have seen in my broader research that after this era of big data fervor, there is a pendulum swinging back, that most organizations do not have a lack of data. They have a lack of resources to cleanse and deal with effectively with the data that they already have. The biggest challenge is ensuring the integrity and the usability of the data resources they currently have. So today in the data management world, data quality is again rising as a very top challenge.
Well, I mean, it sounds like, David, to your point, clients are seeing the fact that just having the data itself isn't sufficient, that they've got to be able to leverage that data. And now when they're actually trying to put it to work, that's the point at which you start to see some of the challenges. If you've got to ensure that the data is higher quality, if you're actually trying to use it for analytics, to be able to actually see anomalies that get thrown at you because of data quality issues, now starts to put a bit of a wrench into your analytical processes as you actually start to do things with the data that you're actually running analytics on.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially since a lot of these models are running automatically. And so before you actually put this in production, you need to make sure that the quality is there, because in many cases it's running and it's actually acting on the results on its own. And you definitely need to make sure that the quality is there.
Data is only as useful as the business decision that it supports and can produce.
Yep.
So,
well, we get back to the what is the old technology saying from how many eons ago? Garbage in, garbage out, right?
absolutely.
Well, but I think one of the things about I think the challenges that we see, and I think one of the things that we were talking about the webinar is you've now got a set of different platforms, you've got lots of different options, you got lots of different sources, and it can be challenging to understand in this new era in which there is greater availability. You now have platforms that can do ingest. In terms of how you actually figure out what that quality looks like, how you can ensure quality as part of that process in terms of ingesting that data, and that's not a simple thing.
Absolutely not. And this is something that we continue to hear from clients as they go through this journey around ingesting data to be more data driven, they're looking at utilizing all these different tools to really make it easy for them to ingest and be able to utilize. And this is what we've been seeing over the past couple of years as more and more clients have been moving towards the cloud and utilizing a lot of the tools that the cloud has to offer. I mean, traditionally, our business was FTP. It was we're loading the data, we're going to give it to you so that you could take it in-house and run your analytics and utilize it. And now more and more clients want to utilize the cloud because data is becoming larger and larger. I mean, many of these alternative data sets are massive in size, and it's not really efficient to deliver it the traditional FTP manner. So they're utilizing the cloud, and they want us to manage loading that in there so that they could actually focus more on the analytics and deriving value for their firm.
Yeah, when you're talking about FTP, I mean, that's the bulk file transfer from the previous century. That just simply is you transfer a big block of data from here to there, and you then you transfer it as a large, indecipherable block. You get it to the other end, you unpack it, and then you have to integrate it into your environment, ingest that data, and manage it. But if you're looking at data sets that you're actually trying to actively run analytics against, you've actually, that whole process, the transfer and ingest process, is just simply too slow to be able to do something that's like near real time in terms of how you're leveraging that data. And now that we're getting to a point at which you've got data marketplaces, you've got live feeds of that data. Now you've got data that is continually being updated, and you can run analytics against it as that feed exists against these various data sources. And that's a real shift in technology and operational mindset for those doing analytics. But it's one that really opens things up quite a bit. One of the other things we're looking at in the data was adoption of technology, shifts to cloud and things of that nature. You were touching a little bit on that page in some of your data as well.
I was. And going back to the data driver and data drifter construct, where you have the organizations that are more data driven in their decision making and the organizations that are slightly less so in their decision making, we again start to see a very large chasm in those adoption practices, right? Because there's an entire world of technology tooling and platforms available theoretically to handle some of these needs. Things like data visualization and analysis, there are self-service data catalogs, self-service data preparation, data fabric tooling or platforms. But when you actually look at adoption trends, it's those data drivers that are disproportionately adopting the specific tools out in the market. So if you look at your organization and you start to introspect and think that you might be a data drifter and be honest with yourself and your organization, you look at the adoption rate for maybe a data catalog or a data fabric, those rates might be lower if you don't have one of those things. But you need to think about these things competitively in your market. What are your peers doing? What are your potential peers doing? I like to think of the competitive landscape as being highly disruptive now, especially post-pandemic, because disruption can come from unexpected angles. With the application of technology and data, you look at things like how rideshare industry completely disrupted the traditional transportation industry. Basically, services and organizations can be disrupted from unexpected angles today. So what you may think of as a competitive peer can completely disrupt your industry using data. And some of this technology adoption is based on data. So yeah, we see major differences in how organizations are adopting today, but some of those key technologies I would say are data fabrics, which are again trying to essentially integrate all of these data silos across the organization and trying to get that more unified view of data assets. And things like data catalogs, which are helping democratize data for things like visualization and analysis.
It sounds like we're getting into situations where we see in a lot of other areas in technology in which you really have this, for lack of a better term, the barbell curve in which you've got big peaks at either end. You've got those who are fairly far along in terms of technology adoption, who are way at the one end of the scale, and then you've got those who really haven't gotten there yet at the other end of the scale. And you now see the gap between them growing all that much larger. And it really speaks to the competitive challenges that those that are behind, in that following curve are working to try and get to catch up. And it seems like, especially in terms of data and analytics, that's something in which they've got to be able to move forward. And Paige, to your point, you have to be aware of where you are relative to your peers. But it is something where if you haven't gotten good enough, there's some challenges there. I wonder, are there tactics to be able to maybe leapfrog if you are that far behind the curve, to be able to get that much further ahead, to start thinking about techniques that are going to help you avoid some of the pitfalls and be able to get you further ahead? Or is that something that those gaps are big enough that they may be insurmountable?
There is no silver bullet. There's never an easy answer. But I will say that when it comes to leveraging data more effectively and trying to advance along that maturity curve, dedicated leadership is one of the key elements of success. And what we have seen in our research over the last several years is that the role of the chief data officer is just skyrocketing in adoption across organizations. So when we first started to ask organizations about adoption of the chief data officer or CDO role a few years ago, the adoption rates were fairly low, around 20% on average. In a couple of years, that jumped up to 40%, or about 40%.
So it's really ensuring that there's somebody who's got responsibility to be able to drive these initiatives forward.
Responsibility and power to delegate, right? And it's not just about how the data is leveraged, it's also balancing the requirements and the stewardship of that data as well. So if you think about functions like compliance, security, governance of that data long term, you need someone high enough up the chain in the organization that has the power and the responsibility to delegate those responsibilities, but has the vision to coordinate and align the objectives across the organization, not only for the proactive use of data, but also for those so-called reactive requirements, which might be something like meeting your compliance requirements, right? They need to be seeing a complete vision for use of data across the organization, not just putting out individual fires.
And I would say when you look at that technology gap, I do believe that it really depends on the client and their use case, right? There's going to be some clients that do not require real-time data to perform analytics right away to make a decision, but rather, you know what? It's end of day is fine. Please, I remember the days when monthly data is what people were utilizing, and it moved to weekly. It's moving to daily, but there's still many people that utilize data that they want to update once a night, and they're happy with their FTP delivery. They built a process around that, and to them, there really is no need yet to move to that cloud. So you'll see that gap until maybe they need to start ingesting some new alternative data that is massive in size and becomes inefficient, until they start realizing, as everyone is highlighting on the call, the competitive edge that a competitor of theirs has over them, because they're using intraday data now, and then they have to move towards cloud or some of these other technologies to be able to stay ahead. So I do think that we'll still see that gap. Even though we've seen a huge shift in more and more of our clients using the cloud, there's still more using FTP delivery than cloud at this point.
Yeah, okay. But so maybe there is that gradual path to be able to get to whatever that next level is that's necessary. But to your point, that in fact, use cases, if what your decision process is, if the way in which you're using the data, it doesn't necessarily need minute by second by kinds of decision and analytics. They can move to that when the mood moves them and as that need requires. So
I would say incremental progress is perfectly acceptable and desirable, right? So
Yeah.
if you're progressing along that maturity curve, it's not reasonable to go from step A to step D, right? There needs to be something in between, and that's something we see a lot with leadership as well. So in our demographics of chief data officers, we see that some organizations have their chief data officer reporting to the CEO, which is very strategic and high level, whereas other organizations have their chief data officer reporting more to a CTO or a CIO, which tends to be a little bit more tactical. And that isn't to say that there is a correct answer. It depends on the maturity of the organization, because if you are a less mature organization, it often makes sense to have a chief data officer that is more tactical and project oriented to take those steps along the way to get you to the place where you need to be. Where if you are already more mature, you probably need that higher level strategic role. So it's all about understanding where you are as an organization and taking the appropriate steps that fit that maturity.
As we often see in technology, one of the biggest issues is not so much the technology itself, but the organizational dynamics and its ability to integrate that technology. We seem to come back to that so often. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you both.
It's
Thank
been a
you,
great
Eric.
time.
Yep. And thank you, Paige, as well. It's been great.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Eric.
Oh, glad to. And I will point our listeners to the webinar that they can get on replay. Hope to get a chance to listen to it to hear even deeper details than we've been able to go into here. Thank you both for being on. And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Zimmon, and Syed Waji Abbas on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Canulosi. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be digging into supply chain technology. It's another conference-focused one with a TPM conference and TPM Tech. We'll be talking to Mark Fontecchio and Eric Johnson, returning guests. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.